My name is Shannon Boucher, and I am returning to the Canadian Culture Wars report during the Canadian federal election. Today is the 28th of March, 2025. I'm recording this today for my mom. I love you, Mom. I'm here in Ottawa. You're out in the Maritimes, and we have had discussions of late. And those discussions, and exchanges on social media kind of echo what the polls are telling us about the Canadian election at this point, that boomers in Canada, those people over the age of 65 now, many of them are overwhelmingly supporting Mark Carney and the Liberal Party. Now, I want to situate myself within some context because the last time I voted for a conservative government was in 20, was 30 years ago. It was for Kim Campbell. And ever since then, I've always voted, and I have voted Liberals, even when Liberals have done things that I really didn't like. I have maintained I'm coming from the left. And speaking of coming from the left, I mean, I did activism for Indigenous issues in the 90s around Canadian residential schools. Okay, I was firmly, it wasn't just a liberal, I was firmly anti-conservative, especially towards the end of Harper's term, and I was also I look back on it now, like emotionally and viscerally anti-Trump from the time he came down the escalator. Okay, nothing's gonna ever make me like the guy, and I'm sharing this because I have deep concerns about this election, and it's absolutely revolting and terrifying to me to think that we might elect another liberal government. Today, I want to talk about the media. Okay. Canadian boomers are still plugged into traditional mainstream media, and it sounds a lot of like a lot of Trumpist or right wing. I mean, the way that the left works is they call everything that they don't like Trump. They associate everything that they don't like in Canada with Donald Trump. And that's designed because Canadians largely, like me, do not like Trump. Okay. And I promised myself when Trump got elected again that I wasn't going to allow myself to get as emotionally invested in his bullshit as I was the first term. I was consumed. I let this guy not just rent free in my head. The guy set up fucking condo towers in my head and took over my emotional life for 4+ years. Promised myself I wasn't going to get that invested again, and I was going to keep myself as impartial as I could to the actions of Donald Trump. And even with his tariff stuff, and even with the wild stuff that's going on in Washington, and this might be the first thing that has you concerned about me. I think that Americans, as bad as Trump is, made the better choice to elect him than Kamala Harris and the Democrats. Democratic support in the United States has completely collapsed. They're below 30% approval rating. They have zero direction. They have the reason they lost was because they went so far on leftist identity politics. So talking to grandparents out there, the boomers of Canada who still have grandchildren, because us Generation Xers, many of us will never know grandchildren. We're just not repopulating. Okay. But you folks all have grandchildren, and I guarantee you that you only have to poke the maximum of 2 of your friends with grandchildren to discover that somewhere in the family tree in your descendants, the state has intervened in your family and taught a grandchild, or more than one in some cases, that they're the opposite sex. This is a gigantic, preposterous, evil lie that is state sanctioned. It's a government policy to teach children that they can be born in the wrong body. Okay? This is egregious. It's terrifying. It is Nazi level medical experimentation on a large scale in Canada in the name of inclusion and equity. That's what it hides behind. Kindness and claims of being kind. And that's the face that our liberal government presents to you. But I think you all know that people can't change sex. And that's not the only egregious issue of this scope and scale. And by the way, the scale is this. Confirmed in national media last fall, 500 children were referred to Children's Hospital of Eastern Ontario in Ottawa last year for medical interventions to the transgender clinic. And they're referred in secret sometimes from the schools, which are empowered to do that, behind parents' backs, because the schools keep secrets from parents. They're state actors teaching these lies to children, okay? I'm talking about lies today. Now, when I do the math and I look at the graphs from around the world and see how this craze, this insane social contagion has taken over, the numbers suggest that 10,000 vulnerable children were sent to gender clinics in Canada in 2024 under liberal policies of transgenderism. And this is not the only lie of this scope and this scale and that has this impact on Canadians that the liberals are telling and have told for years and will continue to tell if we allow them to take power again. The media that you're consuming is owned by the federal government with very few exceptions. Owned. There's a concept in our democratic system that goes back centuries. Divide the world into estates. They're called. They're the domains. There's the estate of production. I forget what they all are, but there's 4 estates and a 5th estate. We know that from a television show. These are the ways that the world is divided. In the U.S., they call it separation of powers. You've got the executive branch, you've got the judicial branch, and you've got the House. And there is federal rights and there's states' rights. And in Canada, we have federal mandates and we have provincial mandates and laws that apply and jurisdictions that apply to each. Well, in our world, there's a very, very important reason why the media is a separate estate from the government, because just like the role of the official opposition in the Westminster system, the job of the opposition is to oppose the government and to criticize the government. That's their job. The job of the media is, in theory, to tell the truth and to hold other estates accountable for their actions. That way we avoid corruption and we avoid tyranny. But our media environment is entirely owned by the liberal government. The media is owned by the government. Now, in what circumstances in history has that happened where that has ever been a good idea? Baby boomers, my parents' generation, even my generation, Generation X, still, we actually got an education about communism and fascism. We know that, everyone loves to talk about Hitler these days and throw it around. But we know that in the Second World War, people like Goebbels, who was an advisor to Hitler, he was the propaganda minister, said, you tell a lie enough times and people will eventually believe it. And you accuse your opposition of that which you are doing. So this demands some responsibility from us as individuals in a media environment where the government owns our media, with small exceptions. Now, I want to explain this ownership to you and explain the baked-in bias and the reason why you cannot trust what the media is saying. You have to internalize an analysis, your own judgment about what the media is saying, and look at the narratives critically. Now, I got the beginnings of my critical journalism faculties from a very well-known far leftist, anarchist, socialist intellectual by the name of Noam Chomsky, professor at MIT. He won a Nobel Prize for his work in linguistics. He's in his 90s now, still talking about these issues. So my tools, what we call an intellectual self-defense, I derived originally from the work of Noam Chomsky, and that term intellectual self-defense came from him. Something called manufacturing consent. What is manufacturing consent? We all remember weapons of mass destruction. And when we were outside of the United States looking in after 9/11, most Canadians, and our Canadian media actually, I think, was doing their job, was saying, hey, wait a second, this is a narrative about weapons of mass destruction. And it came out not long afterwards that the justification for the war against Saddam Hussein in Iraq was fabricated. The institutions of power either manipulated the media or, in collaboration with the American media, put forward a narrative to justify and manufacture the consent of the population to send troops to fight war in Iraq. Now, we're tempted to look back 25 years and say, well, that kind of thing happened in the past. We're tempted to look back and say, well, propaganda was only a thing in World War II, or it was only a real problem in World War I when the term propaganda was used openly and widely. But propaganda is a very real and perhaps even worse tool, more destructive tool today than it was 100 years ago. And not for the least reason that we have countries like China, who, I was listening to an academic last night, China and the authorities in China don't distinguish between wartime and peacetime. They think about influence, and they think about different types of war. Cognitive warfare, information warfare, influence tactics. Same thing with Russia and disinformation. And we are tempted, and our media talks about this ironically. Look over there, those people might be trying to influence you unfairly and unjustly using propaganda and manipulative tactics online. But what they don't tell you is that they are bought and paid for by our own government, and their salaries depend on them getting the Liberals re-elected. The CBC, whose viewership is plummeting, and whose content, CBC has been producing content for young children that tells children that they can change sex with medicine. They have documentaries on the nature of things, saying that we've discovered this new science that gender isn't as simple as boy and girl, male and female, penis and vagina, but that it's a wide spectrum, and that having sex changes as children could help you be more of your true self. That's our public broadcaster, and that is influenced by the Canadian media funding apparatus. Okay? I'm going to read you what an AI told me. So I look at a couple of different AIs. They scrape, broadly to give summary. So I asked Grok for a summary of how the Canadian media is funded by the government. CBC funding, obviously, entirely funded by the government, and they have had a strong and increasingly strong left-wing socialist bias and DEI transgender bias for a long time. They prop up the Liberals, and their audience in the global media landscape is shrinking. They can't actually justify their existence by their viewership or their sponsorship. They're a losing money proposition. And so reporters and journalists and executives at the CBC have a conflict of interest when dealing with an election, because if the Conservatives win, the CBC is going to undergo radical cuts and changes, and it may even be spun out into a private enterprise that has to sink or swim on its own merits. Okay, so the CBC absolutely needs the Liberals to win to continue to exist. Now, we can't imagine possibly that this would not bias their reporters, just on that fact alone. Okay, so I'm going to read this. One key program is a Canadian periodical fund, the CPF, which provides financial assistance to print magazines and non-daily newspapers and digital periodicals, helping them produce and distribute Canadian content. The CPF includes components like aid to publishers, business innovation, collective initiatives, with funding based on factors such as circulation and editorial expenses. Another significant initiative is the Local Journalism LJI initiative, launched in 2019, which funds eligible media organizations to hire journalists or pay freelancers to cover underserved communities. As of March 24, there's some really important words in here: eligible and underserved communities. As of March 2024, the government committed an additional $58 million to extend this program through 2027, supporting over 400 journalists. The content produced is shared via a Creative Commons license to enhance public access to civic journalism. There have been court cases where media that doesn't align with liberal narratives have fought to get funding from this LJI and this CPF fund to support their energy and their efforts. But because their narratives and because their political perspective doesn't align with the liberals, they don't get funding. Okay, we're talking about organizations like Rebel News, which is smeared widely, and True North journalism. So the right wing does not get a perspective funded by the government. The left wing does. And if you're interested in the kind of batshit crazy journalism that does get funded, there's a publication out of Quebec. It's literally called Cult Montreal. It's a radical leftist digital rag that it's a tabloid. It's unbelievable how corrupt and manipulative the stories coming out of this rag are, yet it qualifies for these funding dollars. And okay, we could make a comparison, perhaps, that a far left radical publication gets funding, and I don't like the term far right because it just gets thrown around everywhere. Even though I voted liberal for 30 years and am a left of center traditional, in my politics, I am called far right, radical right. I can't tell you how many times Melanie and I have been called fascists and Nazis for criticizing the narrative. These are words that just get thrown around, so we have to be highly suspicious of these. What a media critic, Canadian guy named Hayakawa, called snarl words. These are intensely emotionally charged words that get thrown around to manipulate your emotions. So, right-wing media or right-of-center media doesn't get funding, but left-wing media does. Okay, government narrative is supported by funding, but a narrative that might get another party elected does not. The government controls our media. The Canadian Media Fund is $600 million a year, on top of the $1.2 billion plus that CBC gets, on top of these LJI initiatives. And what do they filter these criteria through? Let me just, okay, so eligible media organizations. That was my point there. Who is eligible and who's not eligible? And then the question is underserved communities. And I'm going to talk more about diversity, equity, and inclusion, because every single dollar that funds flow through these left-wing liberal supporting media organizations are filtered through this nice sounding set of words: diversity, equity, and inclusion. Well, underneath that diversity, equity, inclusion is transgenderism and so-called marginalized communities. So marginalized communities are Indigenous, Black, transgender, women. We're not talking about remote northern communities here. We're talking about pockets, political activist pockets based on identity in Canada are getting this funding, the underserved. So it's to amplify these so-called marginalized narratives in our country, handing money to activists to push their political agendas in Canada. That's what this local journalism initiative does. You can find this online. You can look it up, the Canadian Media Fund. You can do a little bit of sleuthing. Don't take what I have to say at face value. Okay? Canadian Journalism Labor Tax Credit. That's the next thing. Offers a refundable tax credit. Initially, it was 25% of salaries, up to $55,000 a year for journalists. Increased in 2023 to 35% of salaries per employee. Okay, up to $85,000 per employee. So the salary of journalists owned by the left-wing liberal government is paid for by the government. And if the liberals don't get elected again, this subsidy, this government not just propping up, this ownership and control of Canadian media is threatened. So the careers and livelihoods of journalists all across the country, CBC, CTV, Global, all of these other publications who get these subsidies, it's going to go away, and they're going to have to actually compete based on their merit and their competence in the media environment in order to get paid. They'll actually have to serve the interests of Canadians instead of the liberal government. I am deeply, deeply concerned at just how blind we have become and complacent we have become in Canada to assume that our government and our media are looking out for our best interest. The only interest that they're really looking out for at this point is their own. You can tell that this is something that I'm very concerned about, I'm sure. Canadian Media Fund, a public-private partnership, finances audiovisual content creation, including some journalism-related projects with annual funding of $366 million from the government and broadcasting distribution undertakings. Meanwhile, CBC Radio Canada, CBC's public broadcaster, receives government funding, a budget of $1.38 billion for 2024-2025. It's a little bit higher than that. The total, the top number for the annual funding isn't 366, it's closer to 600 million. And maybe that's explained a little bit in the next bit. Finally, the Online News Act, that's Bill C-18, passed in 2023, mandates that tech giants like Google pay $100 million annually to Canadian news outlets, indirectly bolstering journalism through negotiated agreements overseen by the CRTC, overseen by the government. These combined efforts, direct subsidies, tax credits, and third-party contributions reflect a multifaceted approach to sustaining the Canadian media, aka protecting the Liberal government's power. All of these have sparked debate about journalistic independence and public trust. Why am I talking about all this? I started by talking about Donald Trump and the narrative that we're getting, the cross-border stuff, the 51st state stuff, the tariff stuff, and we find ourselves in a situation, I'm going to talk about this in another video. Well, remember this, right? Those Canadians overwhelmingly, like we dismissed or really were critical of the weapons of mass destruction, we saw through the bullshit. In Canada, we largely saw through Trump's bellicose mercurial, a narcissistic behavior in the White House in his first election campaign and his first term. We're deeply, deeply skeptical and even repulsed by his behavior. We are failing to see the problems within our own media ecosystem. So in the next video, I'm going to talk about the 51st state narrative. And I want to tie in what we all know and what we've all heard many, many times, that strong men, dictators, tyrants, authoritarian leaders will often come to power under the narrative that I alone can save you. That's where we're at. Thanks for watching. Make sure you like and subscribe. Canadian Culture Wars Report. Maybe Melanie and I will get together and chat about this in the coming weeks. The Canadian election is one of the most, if not the most important elections in our living memories in Canada. We are in a new world, a dangerous world, and truth must out.